What would you do if your inheritance consisted of a single abandoned structure that everyone in your family deemed worthless? What if, beneath that crumbling edifice, lay something so extraordinary that it would reshape not just your life, but the understanding of history itself? For 24-year-old Eleanor Hartwell, these were not rhetorical questions, but the stark reality of her circumstances on the day her great-uncle's will was read in a solicitor's dusty office in Cambridge. Eleanor's great-uncle, Thomas Hartwell, had been the family eccentric, a man who had spent 50 years in near-total isolation, living in an ancient windmill on the marshlands of East Anglia, conducting experiments and correspondence that no one in the family had bothered to understand. When he died at the age of 93, his passing was marked by a kind of relieved silence, as if the family had been waiting for decades for this inconvenience to finally resolve itself. The will had been straightforward, the windmill and its contents to Eleanor Hartwell, his great-niece, in the hope that she might prove to have the curiosity that has so lamentably been absent in the rest of our line. The laughter had begun immediately. Eleanor's mother had been the first to voice her disdain. That drafty old ruin? What on earth is Eleanor supposed to do with that? It's barely standing. The land is worthless. Nothing but marsh and mist. Thomas was mad, clearly, and has managed to inflict his madness upon the one person in this family least equipped to deal with it. Eleanor's brothers had chimed in with their own forms of dismissal. Sell it, they advised, or let it fall into the sea. Either way, you'll be better off forgetting it exists. But Eleanor, quiet, observant Eleanor, who had never quite fit into the particular mold her family had designed for her, had felt something shift in her chest as she read her great-uncle's words. The hope that she might prove to have the curiosity. She had barely known Thomas Hartwell. He had attended family gatherings perhaps twice in her lifetime, always sitting slightly apart, always observing, always seeming to see something in Eleanor that she was only just beginning to recognize in herself. And he had left her the windmill. Settle in and let us journey back to the marshlands of East Anglia in the spring of 1889, to a story of inherited curiosity, of secrets buried beneath the earth, and of the extraordinary consequences of choosing to look deeper when everyone else has already turned away. Part 1. The Inheritance. The journey from London to Marston-on-Mere took the better part of a day. Eleanor travelled by rail to Norwich, then by hired carriage, along increasingly narrow roads that seemed to lead nowhere at all. The landscape transformed as they travelled east. The ordered farmland gave way to something wilder and stranger. The earth became soft and unreliable. The sky seemed to expand until it dominated everything, vast and changeable and full of light. And then, rising from the flatness like something that did not quite belong to the natural world, she saw it. The windmill. It was larger than Eleanor had imagined from her great-uncle's brief description. It was circular, built of weathered brick that had faded to a pale, dusty rose, with a conical cap that had once been painted blue but was now a mottled grey. The sails were missing. They had been removed decades ago, the driver explained, leaving only the framework, like exposed ribs. The structure seemed impossibly tall, impossibly fragile, impossibly lonely in the vast emptiness of the marsh. "There's a cottage," the driver said, pointing to a small stone building, perhaps 100 yards from the mill. "Your great-uncle lived in that mostly, these past years. The mill itself, well, I wouldn't trust my weight to those stairs, miss. They've been poorly maintained." Eleanor gathered her travelling case and stepped down from the carriage. The air smelled of salt and growing things, of water and distance. The wind moved across the marshland with a sighing sound that was almost mournful. "Will you wait?" she asked the driver. "I only mean to assess the situation." He looked doubtful, but agreed, settling himself and the horses to wait. The cottage was small, perhaps 4 rooms, but it had been cared for with evident intention. Inside, Eleanor found evidence of a life devoted to study and contemplation. Books lined every shelf. Papers were stacked on tables and chairs, organized according to some system that only their owner could have understood. The furniture was worn but clean. A small fireplace held ashes from what must have been yesterday's fire. In the bedroom, Eleanor found a journal lying on the nightstand. She opened it carefully, finding handwritten entries dated from recent months, the handwriting increasingly shaky, but still clear. March 15th. The patterns hold true. 40 years of observation, and the calculations remain consistent. Eleanor will understand when she is ready. The mill keeps its secrets only from those who do not think to ask the proper questions. I have left her everything necessary: the books, the correspondence, the diagrams. She will find her way. March 22nd. I have arranged for the sealed chamber to remain undisturbed. The lock is sound. The provisions will last. When the time comes, she will know what to do. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read. Her great-uncle had known her, had anticipated her inheritance, had believed, in a way no one else in the family seemed to, that she possessed some quality that would allow her to understand whatever was hidden in this place. Sealed chamber, provisions. The windmill itself seemed to be watching her, waiting. She made a decision then, not a rational decision perhaps, but one that felt inevitable. She would not return to London. She would send word that she was remaining to assess her inheritance, to determine whether it could be salvaged or should be sold, and she would explore the windmill completely. Part 2. Descent. The entrance to the mill was through a low wooden door at its base, painted the same faded blue as the missing cap had been. It was locked, but Eleanor found a key among the items left to her in her great-uncle's room, a heavy brass key, marked only with a small star. The interior of the windmill was a revelation. The lower chamber was perhaps 20 feet in diameter, with a packed earth floor and walls of brick that had been whitewashed long ago. But what caught Eleanor's attention immediately was not the architecture, but what occupied the space. The entire lower chamber was a library. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their spines faded, but clearly organized according to some careful system. There were volumes on mathematics and natural philosophy, on geology and astronomy, on engineering and mechanical design. There were leather-bound journals by the dozens, each one labeled with a date. There were technical drawings and architectural plans spread across a large table in the center of the space. Eleanor moved slowly through the chamber, running her fingers along the spines of the books, trying to understand what her great-uncle had been doing in this isolated place for 50 years. And then she saw the stairs. They descended from the center of the chamber, spiraling downward into darkness. Eleanor had assumed that the windmill, like all windmills, was built upon a foundation and extended upward. But these stairs led down, far down, into the earth beneath the mill. There was a lamp hanging beside the stairs. Eleanor found matches in her pocket and lit it, watching the shadows leap and dance on the brick walls. The stairs were steep, narrow, and clearly very old. They descended for what seemed like an impossible distance. Eleanor counted the steps as she descended. 20, 40, 60. The air grew cooler. The smell changed. No longer the salt marsh smell of the surface, but something older, damper, something that suggested great age and undisturbed stillness. At 87 steps, the stairs ended. Eleanor stepped into a chamber that took her breath away. It was not natural. The walls and floor had been carved from bedrock, ancient chalk, she thought, remembering what little she knew of geology, and had been shaped with obvious intention. The ceiling was perhaps 12 feet high, and the chamber extended beyond the reach of her lamplight in both directions. But what dominated the space was the machinery. It was impossible, utterly impossible, yet it was undeniably there, occupying the center of the vast underground chamber, a structure of brass and steel and copper, assembled with mechanical precision, all wheels and gears and intricate mechanisms. It rose perhaps 8 feet tall, and was easily 20 feet in length and 15 feet in width. It was, Eleanor realized with a shudder of recognition, some kind of calculating engine, but not one she had ever heard of. She had read, as many educated women did, of Mr. Babbage's analytical engine, the legendary calculating machine that had existed only in plans and dreams. But this was not Babbage's design, though it seemed to share some philosophical kinship with it. This was something else entirely. Eleanor approached it slowly, her lamp casting wavering light across the brass surfaces. She saw, as she drew closer, that it was covered in a thin layer of dust, but the mechanisms themselves appeared to be in perfect condition. There were copper plates engraved with mathematical notations. There were wheels marked with numbers from 0 to 9. There were levers and switches, and what appeared to be some system of interchangeable cards or tablets. On a table beside the machine lay a journal, larger than the others, bound in soft leather that had aged to a deep golden brown. Eleanor picked it up with reverent care and opened it. The first page bore a single sentence. "This is the record of the Hartwell analytical engine, conceived in 1839 and brought to completion in 1841, the work of Thomas Hartwell, natural philosopher and mechanical engineer, in pursuit of truth and the advancement of human knowledge." Eleanor sank onto a nearby stool, her lamp trembling in her hand. Her great-uncle had built a calculating engine, a machine of extraordinary complexity and sophistication, a machine that, from what she could see, represented a level of mechanical innovation that should not have existed at the time of its construction. She began to read. Part 3. The Journals. Eleanor spent the next hours moving between the machine itself and the journals that described its creation and function. She read by lamplight as the sun moved across the sky above, as the spring afternoon turned toward evening, as the shadows in the underground chamber lengthened and deepened. Thomas Hartwell had been born in 1796. He had studied mathematics at Cambridge, had been recognized as a prodigy, and had been expected to become a scholar of some distinction. But something had turned him away from the conventional world of academia. In his early journals, Eleanor found evidence of this pivotal moment. 1818. The university has suggested that my interests lie too far outside the established boundaries of respectability. My papers on mechanical calculation have been deemed speculative and of limited practical application. They do not understand. The mind works as a machine works. Emotion, sensation, reason itself, all of these are merely different expressions of mechanical law. If we can understand and replicate the mechanism, we can extend human thought itself. but they will not permit me to pursue this work within the confines of Cambridge. I must make another path. For the next 20 years, according to the journals, Thomas Hartwell had worked in secret. He had studied the designs of mechanical clocks, of looms with punch cards, of any machine that might suggest a way to mechanize calculation. He had corresponded, under assumed names, with natural philosophers throughout Europe. He had slowly, painstakingly, developed his designs. And then, in 1839, he had begun to build. The engineering required was extraordinary. Thomas had had to invent new techniques for machining brass and steel to the necessary tolerances. He had had to solve problems of mechanical synchronization and information transfer that no one had solved before. He had worked, according to his journals, in virtual isolation, driven by a vision that consumed him entirely. 1840. I have begun to assemble the calculating section. The precision required is almost beyond what seems mechanically possible, yet it is possible. Every day I discover that what appeared to be an absolute limit is merely the boundary of my own current skill. If the mind can conceive it, the hands may achieve it. This is the great secret that the universities do not teach. And then, in 1841, August 12th, the machine is complete. I have run the test calculation 17 times, and each time it provides the correct answer. A calculation that would require a human mathematician 6 hours has been completed by the machine in 3 minutes. The age of mechanical thought has begun. But then something had happened. The journals abruptly shifted. Thomas's tone changed from triumphant to fearful, from ambitious to guarded. August 30th. I have begun to understand the implications of what I have created. A machine that can calculate is a tool, merely, but a machine that can calculate accurately and reliably, without fatigue or human error, is something more. It is a fundamental challenge to the nature of human intellect. If machines can think, what becomes of the human soul? What becomes of God's special gift of reason to man? I have destroyed the original drawings. I have sealed this chamber. I have decided that I will live here, in isolation, preserving the machine, but permitting no one else to know of its existence. It is too dangerous. Society is not ready for this knowledge. Perhaps society will never be ready. And yet, I cannot bring myself to destroy the machine itself. It is too beautiful, too perfect, too much a part of my own soul. So I will preserve it, and I will study it, and perhaps, in the fullness of time, someone will come who is wise enough to understand what it represents. Eleanor understood then why her great-uncle had lived in isolation for 50 years. He had been guarding something. He had been wrestling with the implications of what he had created, and he had decided that the world was not ready for that knowledge. But he had left it to her. Eleanor climbed back up the long spiral of stairs as the evening light was fading from the windows of the cottage. She felt as though she had lived a lifetime in the few hours since her arrival. Her mind was reeling with implications, with possibilities, with the weight of a secret that her great-uncle had carried alone for decades. She found a notebook and pen in the cottage, and by lamplight, she began to write out her thoughts, her observations, her understanding of what the machine represented, and as she wrote, a question began to form. What was she meant to do with this knowledge? Part 4. The Decision. Over the following weeks, Eleanor made a careful study of the mill and its underground chamber. She learned the machine's functions through methodical experimentation. She tested its calculations, verifying them against manual mathematics. She discovered that it was capable not merely of basic arithmetic, but of more complex operations. It could solve quadratic equations, could calculate trigonometric functions, could work through logarithmic progressions. She also began to understand the broader implications of what her great-uncle had created. In her studies, she had come across references to Mr. Babbage's analytical engine. She obtained copies of Ada Lovelace's notes on Babbage's machine, and she realized that Thomas Hartwell had, independently, arrived at many of the same insights that Babbage and Lovelace had achieved, but he had done so in isolation, without the benefit of their work, and he had actually brought his machine to completion. This was extraordinary. This was, potentially, historically significant. It was also deeply problematic. If Eleanor revealed the existence of the machine, she would be challenging the historical record. She would be asserting that a self-taught mechanical engineer working in isolation in East Anglia had achieved what some of the greatest mathematical minds of the age had merely theorized. She would be opening herself to skepticism, to accusations of fraud, to the social consequences of being a woman claiming knowledge of sophisticated mechanical engineering. She knew what her family would do if she told them. They would laugh. They would suggest that she had been deceived by an old man's fantasies. They would insist that she sell the mill, that she move on to some proper life, marriage presumably, or a respectable position as a governess or companion. But Eleanor had come to understand something about herself in the weeks since her arrival at the mill. She had come to understand that she possessed something she had not known she possessed, a genuine curiosity about how things worked, a desire to understand, to explore, to push the boundaries of what she thought was possible. Her great-uncle had left her not merely a windmill, but permission to be herself. In early June, Eleanor made a decision. She would not reveal the machine's existence. Not yet. Not until she had conducted a far more thorough study. Not until she had verified everything her great-uncle had accomplished. Not until she had determined whether there might be applications for the machine's technology that could benefit the wider world. To do this, she would need to remain at the mill. She would need to make it known that she was living there, that she was managing the property, that she had no intention of selling. And she would need to find allies, people who could help her understand the implications of what she had discovered, who could be trusted with the secret, who could help her navigate the treacherous waters of revealing knowledge that challenged the accepted history of mechanical innovation. She wrote to her family first, informing them of her decision. The responses were swift and, as she had anticipated, dismissive. From her mother, "I cannot imagine what you think you are accomplishing by remaining in that God-forsaken place. Your great-uncle's eccentricity is no excuse for throwing away your own future. Return to London immediately." From her eldest brother, "The property should be sold. The money, though modest, would provide you with some security. Your current course of action is highly improper and will reflect poorly upon the family." Eleanor filed these letters away and did not respond. Instead, she began to methodically organize her great-uncle's papers and correspondence. Among them, she discovered something extraordinary. Letters exchanged between Thomas Hartwell and Ada Lovelace's mother, Lady Byron, before Ada's death in 1852. In these letters, Thomas had presented his work to the woman most likely to understand its significance, but had requested that she maintain the secrecy he required. Lady Byron, it seemed, had honored his wishes. There were also letters from a colleague, Dr. James Whitmore, a physician and natural philosopher based in Norwich, who had become aware of Thomas's work and had corresponded with him regarding its implications. These letters suggested that Dr. Whitmore had, in his own way, understood what Thomas was attempting. Eleanor made a decision to contact Dr. Whitmore's grandson, who still lived in Norwich and was, from what she could discover, respected in the natural philosophy community there. Part 5. The Revelation. Charles Whitmore was 42 years old, a man of considerable learning and an open mind that was rare among the scientific establishment of the day. Eleanor invited him to the mill under the pretense of discussing a historical project, a biography, she said, of her great-uncle, for whom Dr. Whitmore's grandfather had corresponded. When he arrived, on a warm day in July, Eleanor served him tea in the cottage, and then, watching his face carefully, asked if he would like to see what she had discovered in her great-uncle's papers. She led him down the spiral stairs in silence, lighting the lamps as they descended. When they reached the bottom, she saw his face transform. He stood in absolute stillness for what seemed like a very long time, his eyes moving across the machine, across the walls with their carefully preserved documents, across the accumulated evidence of 50 years of work. "My God," he said finally, "is it real? Is it actually functional?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "Would you like to see it work?" For the next 3 hours, Eleanor demonstrated the machine's capabilities. She showed Dr. Whitmore the test calculations her great-uncle had performed, the mathematical proofs he had documented, the innovations he had engineered. When it was over, Dr. Whitmore sat heavily on a stool, his face pale. "Do you understand what you possess?" he asked. "Do you comprehend what your great-uncle achieved?" "I believe I am beginning to," Eleanor said. "This is not merely a mechanical curiosity," Dr. Whitmore continued. "This is a machine that demonstrates principles that should revolutionize our understanding of calculation, of information, of the very nature of mechanical thought. Your great-uncle was ahead of his time by decades. And you are a woman who has understood what it is. You must publish this. You must make it known to the world." "I cannot," Eleanor said. "Not as I am. I am a woman. No one would believe me. They would dismiss the work as fantasy, or worse, as fraud. And my family would intervene." Dr. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. "There is another possibility," he said finally. "My son is a physician, as I am, but he has also taken an interest in mechanical philosophy and engineering. He is establishing a journal, the International Review of Mechanical Innovation, and he is actively seeking to publish work that challenges conventional thinking. If you were to write a paper describing your great-uncle's machine, explaining its principles and its capabilities, I believe my son would consider it seriously." "As a woman author?" Eleanor asked doubtfully. "As a woman author," Dr. Whitmore affirmed, "though you might choose to publish under a nom de plume, should you prefer. But the work itself, the work would be undeniable." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a possibility she had not dared to imagine. Part 6. Publication. Over the following months, Eleanor undertook the work of documenting her great-uncle's achievement. She wrote with meticulous care, beginning with a historical overview of the development of calculating machines, then moving to a detailed description of Thomas Hartwell's independent discovery of mechanical calculation principles. She included technical drawings, mathematical proofs, and descriptions of the machine's actual operations verified through her own experimentation. She wrote it all in her own handwriting, in her own voice, but she signed it with her great-uncle's name. A complete account of the Hartwell Analytical Engine by Thomas Hartwell, being a posthumous publication edited and verified by E. H. Hartwell. Dr. Whitmore's son, Edward received the manuscript with evident interest. He read it with the careful attention of someone trained in technical subjects, and he wrote back requesting clarification on several points. Eleanor provided these clarifications, and he confirmed his intention to publish the paper in the first issue of his new journal. The publication, when it came in January 1890, was restrained but significant. The paper appeared without fanfare in a journal that was just beginning its existence and was read primarily by natural philosophers and mechanical engineers in Europe and America. But the response, when it came, was extraordinary. Letters began arriving at the mill, first a trickle, then a flood. Scientists and engineers requested more information. They asked questions about specific mechanisms. They expressed astonishment that such a machine could have been constructed without the wider scientific community's knowledge. Most significantly, a letter arrived from the Royal Society requesting permission to examine the machine itself. They were prepared to send a delegation, they wrote, composed of their most respected members. Eleanor granted permission, and in the spring of 1890, 3 of the most eminent mechanical engineers in Britain arrived at the Windmill on the marshlands. The examination took place over 3 days. Eleanor showed them everything: the machine, the original drawings, the test calculations, the journals documenting the construction. She answered their technical questions with precision and clarity. She explained her great-uncle's innovations and the principles underlying the machine's design. On the final evening, the lead examiner, a distinguished engineer named Professor Henry Cavendish, asked to speak with Eleanor alone in the cottage. "Young woman," he said, "I must ask you directly, to what extent did you participate in the creation of this machine? Your explanations have been too comprehensive, too technically sophisticated, to suggest that you merely inherited a device whose operations you did not understand." Eleanor met his gaze directly. "My great-uncle created the machine," she said. 50 years of work. The design, the engineering, the construction, all of that was his. But I have spent the last year coming to understand his work completely. I have performed independent calculations to verify the machine's function. I have studied his journals and his methodology. I have attempted to replicate, in smaller mechanisms, some of his innovations. So yes, I have engaged deeply with the technical aspects of his achievement, but I did not create the machine. Professor Cavendish nodded slowly. "I believe you," he said, "and I wish to say something, Miss Hartwell, that I trust you will take seriously. You possess a gift for mechanical and mathematical thinking that is uncommon. The fact that you are a woman does not change the reality of that gift. Should you ever wish to pursue further study, to develop your own contributions to the field of mechanical engineering, you would find allies in the scientific community. There are those of us who believe that the exclusion of women from scientific thought is an impoverishment of science itself." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but she held them back. "Thank you," she said. I cannot express adequately what that means to me." Part 7. Legacy. The Royal Society's report, issued in June of 1890, was a carefully worded document that acknowledged the existence and functionality of the Hartwell analytical engine while noting the unusual circumstances of its preservation and study. The report did not accuse Eleanor of fraud. It did not dismiss the machine as a fancy or a deception. What it did was place Thomas Hartwell's work firmly in the historical record as an independent and legitimate precursor to the mechanical calculation engines that were being developed in the latter years of the 19th century. Eleanor's family's response to this development was mixed. Her mother, upon reading that her daughter had been instrumental in bringing a significant scientific achievement to the attention of the Royal Society, underwent a remarkable change in perspective. She began, cautiously, to express pride in Eleanor's accomplishment. She suggested that Eleanor might be capable of conducting a more elevated life than she had previously imagined. Her brothers, recognizing that the windmill was no longer a useless piece of property, but a site of scientific and historical significance, began to take a different interest in it. They suggested that Eleanor might benefit from their advice in managing what had become, in effect, an important archive. Eleanor declined their offers of assistance with characteristic firmness. Instead, she began the work of establishing the mill as a center of study and research. She recruited funding from the Royal Society and other sources. She hired a small staff of researchers and engineers, including, notably, 2 women with degrees in mathematics who had been unable to find positions in traditional academic settings. She established a laboratory where researchers could come to study the Hartwell engine and to conduct their own mechanical calculation experiments. She created a library devoted to the history and development of calculating machines. She began work on a comprehensive biography of her great-uncle, based on his journals and correspondence, that would situate his work within the broader history of mechanical innovation. The windmill, which had been abandoned and mocked, became a destination for natural philosophers and engineers from across Europe. The small cottage at its base was expanded to accommodate visiting researchers. The underground chamber, which had been sealed in isolation for 50 years, became one of the most important sites of mechanical innovation study in the world. And Eleanor Hartwell, the woman whom her family had dismissed as incapable of managing even her own modest inheritance, became one of the most significant figures in the early history of mechanical engineering, a woman who had not merely inherited a secret, but who had understood its importance and had had the courage to reveal it to the world. Part 8. Conclusion. 30 years later, as Eleanor approached 60 years of age, she stood once more in the underground chamber of her mill. The machine that her great-uncle had built was now carefully preserved under glass. It no longer operated. It was far too precious for that. But it still occupied the place of honor in the center of the chamber. Around it, the chamber had been transformed into a working laboratory and archive. Young researchers were conducting experiments. New calculating machines, improved versions, based on the principles Thomas had discovered, were being designed and tested. The accumulated knowledge of 5 decades was being systematically organized and documented. On the wall where her great-uncle had preserved only the machine in secrecy, there now hung a portrait of Thomas Hartwell, painted from descriptions provided by those who had known him. Beside it hung a portrait of Eleanor herself, painted by a respected artist in 1895, showing her in the underground chamber, standing before the machine, with her hand resting upon it, her expression thoughtful and calm. The inscription beneath the portraits read, Thomas Hartwell, 1796 to 1889, natural philosopher and mechanical engineer, creator of the Hartwell analytical engine. Eleanor Hartwell, 1865 present, scholar and historian, guardian and revealer of her great-uncle's legacy. Both possessed the courage to think beyond the boundaries of their time. Eleanor had never married. She had declined several respectable offers, each one kindly and with full explanation of her commitment to her work. She had developed deep friendships with her colleagues, both the male engineers and natural philosophers who had come to respect her work, and the female scholars and researchers who had been given opportunities through her patronage. She had discovered, in the process of honoring her great-uncle's legacy, a life of genuine purpose and meaning. She had learned that the greatest inheritance is not money or property, but the permission, the explicit permission, to pursue the work that calls to one's soul. That evening, as she climbed the spiral stairs back toward the cottage above, she paused at a particular step and ran her fingers along a small inscription carved into the brick. It was her great-uncle's handwriting, tiny and precise. To whoever finds this, you are the one for whom it was meant. Trust your curiosity. The world needs more people brave enough to see beyond the obvious. Eleanor smiled. She had spent 30 years proving her great-uncle right. She had spent 30 years demonstrating that sometimes, when everyone in the world has turned away from something, dismissing it as worthless or impossible, there is still someone brave enough to look deeper, to ask the right questions, to recognize that value can be hidden beneath the surface, waiting only for the proper attention to reveal itself. The windmill still turned in the wind above, though its sails were gone and would never spin again. But the work within it, the work of understanding, of building, of pushing the boundaries of human knowledge, that work continued on, as it would for generations to come, because one woman had chosen to inherit more than property. She had chosen to inherit her great-uncle's faith in the power of human curiosity, and in doing so, she had transformed not just her own life, but the future of mechanical thought itself. What seems worthless to the world may contain extraordinary value when observed with genuine curiosity and courage. Thank you for spending this time with Eleanor, witnessing her journey from a woman, her family dismissed, to a scholar whose work shaped the development of mechanical science. It's a powerful reminder that the greatest inheritances we receive are often intangible. Permission, example, the faith that we are capable of more than the world believes. If Eleanor's story moved you, if the discovery of the Hartwell engine captured your imagination, please leave a like and tell us in the comments what aspect of her journey resonated with you most deeply. Was it the moment of discovery, the courage to preserve rather than reveal, the transformation of a place of isolation into a center of innovation? Be sure to subscribe for more stories of hidden legacies, extraordinary discoveries, and the remarkable transformations that occur when we dare to look beneath the surface of what everyone else has dismissed. We'll see you next time in another story of quiet courage and remarkable revelation.